You think you're making choices, but what if most of your life is being decided before you even realize it? Not by fate, not by luck, but by something inside you that you've never truly looked at. You say you want success, yet you keep procrastinating. You say you want a healthy relationship, yet you keep choosing the same kind of people who hurt you. You say you want change, yet you fall back into the same habits, the same reactions, the same outcomes. And at some point, you stop questioning it. You just sigh and say, that's just how my life is. You call it destiny. But what if it's not destiny at all? Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That means the patterns you don't understand are the ones controlling you the most. The reactions you think are just who you are might actually be old emotional scripts running in the background. Think about it. Have you ever overreacted to something small and later wondered why? Have you ever pushed someone away even though you didn't want to? Have you ever delayed something important, not because you were lazy, but because something inside you resisted it? That something is not random. It has a history. It has a reason. But because you don't see it, you don't question it. You obey it. Imagine a man who grew up constantly being criticized. As a child, he learned that nothing he did was ever good enough. Now, he's an adult. On the surface, he looks ambitious, driven, always trying to prove himself. But deep down, he carries that same voice. You're not enough. So every time he gets close to success, he sabotages it. He procrastinates, he overthinks, he avoids finishing what he starts. Not because he's incapable, but because a part of him is still trying to protect him from failure, from judgment, from feeling that same pain again. And he doesn't see it. He just says, I guess I'm not disciplined enough. But it's not discipline he lacks. It's awareness. Or think about someone who keeps falling into toxic relationships. They say they want love, respect, stability, but somehow they keep choosing people who are distant, unavailable, or emotionally cold. Why? Because somewhere in their past, love felt like that. Maybe they had to earn attention. Maybe affection was inconsistent. So now their mind recognizes chaos as familiarity, and familiarity feels like comfort. They're not choosing pain consciously. They're repeating what feels known. And when it ends the same way again, they don't say, I'm repeating a pattern. They say, I'm just unlucky in love. This is how the unconscious works. Quiet, invisible, but incredibly powerful. It shapes your decisions, your fears, your desires, your limits. It whispers instead of shouting. So you think it's your own voice. And because you think it's you, you don't question it. You defend it. You build your identity around it. I'm just like this. I've always been this way. That's just how things are for me. But what if that's not who you are? What if that's just what you've been conditioned to believe? Let me ask you something. How many times have you told yourself you'll change, only to fall back into the same cycle? How many times have you promised you'll start tomorrow, next week, next month? And when you don't, you blame your motivation, your environment, your circumstances. But rarely do you stop and ask the deeper question, what inside me is resisting this change? Because the truth is, people don't just fail because they lack effort. They fail because something inside them is working against them. And that's the uncomfortable part, because it means the problem isn't out there. It's not your job, not your friends, not your situation. It's something within you that you haven't faced yet, something you've ignored, suppressed, or avoided. And as long as it stays in the dark, it will keep influencing everything you do. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle choices, small habits, repeated patterns that slowly shape your entire life. So when you look at your life right now, your habits, your relationships, your results, ask yourself honestly, is this really what I chose? Or is this what I've been unconsciously repeating? Because the moment you start questioning that, the moment you begin to see the patterns instead of just living them, that's when everything begins to change. You're not acting based on logic as much as you think. You're reacting based on things you don't even realize are there. Most of what drives your decisions isn't happening in your mind you can see. It's happening underneath it. Quiet, automatic, and incredibly consistent. And the dangerous part is not that it exists, it's that you don't notice it. Because the moment you don't notice something, you stop questioning it. And when you stop questioning it, it starts controlling you. Carl Jung built much of his work around this exact idea, the unconscious mind. Not some abstract concept, but a very real system of stored experiences, beliefs, fears, and emotional patterns that shape how you see the world. Think of it like a hidden script running in the background. You didn't consciously write it, you didn't even realize it was being written, but it's there, influencing what you feel, how you react, and what you believe is possible for you. Let's make this real. Imagine someone who always feels the need to prove themselves. In every conversation, every opportunity, they push harder than necessary. They overwork, they overexplain, they overthink. On the surface, it looks like ambition, but underneath, there's something else, a deep, unconscious belief that they're not enough. Maybe they grew up in an environment where approval was rare. Maybe they were only praised when they achieved something. So their mind learned, if I don't perform, I don't matter. Now they're older, but that belief is still running. They don't wake up and say, I feel worthless, so I must prove myself. No, they just feel an internal pressure they can't explain, and they act on it. That's how the unconscious operates. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, hey, this is coming from your past. It just feels like you. It feels natural. It feels justified. And that's why it's so powerful, because you don't question what feels natural. Or take another example. Someone gets criticized at work. It's a small comment, nothing extreme, but their reaction is intense. They feel attacked, defensive, even angry. They replay the moment over and over in their head. Now, logically, they know it wasn't a big deal, but emotionally, it hits much deeper. Why? Because that moment didn't just trigger the present. It activated something older, maybe a childhood memory of being judged, maybe a history of feeling inadequate. The unconscious doesn't separate past from present, it blends them. So your reaction today might actually be a response to something that happened years ago. And here's the problem, you don't see that connection. You just see your reaction. So you justify it. They were disrespectful. I had a right to be angry. Maybe that's partially true, but it's not the full picture. The full picture includes everything underneath, the hidden layers shaping that reaction. This is why two people can go through the same situation and respond completely differently. One shrugs it off, the other spirals into stress and self-doubt. The situation is the same. The difference is internal. The difference is unconscious. Now think about your own life. Think about the moments where your reaction didn't match the situation. The times you avoided something important without a clear reason. The times you felt fear, hesitation, or resistance when logically you knew you should move forward. That's not weakness. That's not randomness. That's your unconscious stepping in. It's trying to protect you, but in outdated ways. It's using old information to handle new situations. And sometimes that protection becomes limitation. You avoid opportunities because they feel uncomfortable. You stay in familiar situations because they feel safe. You repeat patterns because they feel known, not because they're good for you, but because they're recognized by your internal system. And the most important thing to understand is this: you can't change what you're not aware of. You can try to force discipline, you can try to push motivation, but if there's something underneath resisting you, you'll always feel like you're fighting yourself, because you are. So instead of asking, why can't I change? Maybe the better question is, what inside me is preventing this change? Instead of saying, this is just how I am, start asking, where did this come from? Because the moment you shift from reacting to observing, from blindly following your patterns to actually noticing them, you create space, space to question, space to understand, and eventually space to choose differently. And that's where everything begins, not with control, not with force, but with awareness. You think you're moving forward, but look closely. How much of your life is actually new? And how much of it is just a repetition with different faces, different places, different names? The truth is, most people don't create their lives, they replay them. Same patterns, same reactions, same endings, just in slightly different forms. And because the details change, you convince yourself the story is different. But the outcome, it feels strangely familiar. Carl Jung believed that until you become aware of your inner patterns, you are doomed to repeat them, not because you're unlucky, not because life is against you, but because your mind is wired to return to what it already knows. Familiarity feels safe, even when it's painful. Let's Let's make this real. Think about someone who keeps ending up in the same kind of relationship. At first, it feels exciting. There's chemistry, intensity, emotion, but slowly things shift. The other person becomes distant, communication breaks down, the same arguments appear, and eventually it falls apart again and again and again. After a while, they stop asking, "Why does this keep happening?" and start saying, "I guess I just have bad luck in love." But is it really luck or is it a pattern? Because what if deep down they're not choosing partners randomly? What if they're unconsciously drawn to a certain type, someone who feels familiar, not necessarily healthy? Maybe they grew up in an environment where love was inconsistent, where attention had to be earned, where emotional distance felt normal. So now, as an adult, stability feels boring and unpredictability feels like connection. They're not choosing pain on purpose, they're choosing what their mind recognizes. And recognition feels like comfort. This doesn't just happen in relationships, it happens in your habits, your work, your decisions. Think about how many times you've told yourself, this time will be different. You start something new, a project, a goal, a routine. You're motivated at the beginning, focused, determined. But then, slowly, the same things creep in: distractions, doubt, delay. You lose momentum, you stop, and you end up exactly where you've been before. And again, you explain it the same way: I just need more discipline. But what if discipline isn't the real issue? What if the real issue is that you're running the same internal script? Because your mind doesn't like uncertainty. It prefers predictability, even if that predictability leads to failure. There's a strange kind of comfort in knowing how things will end, even if the ending isn't good. It's familiar, it's known, and your unconscious is designed to keep you in what feels known, not necessarily what helps you grow. Let me ask you something. Have you ever sabotaged something good without understanding why? Maybe things were finally going well. You were making progress, getting closer to what you wanted, and suddenly you pulled back, you hesitated, you delayed, you found reasons to stop, and later you looked back and thought, why did I do that? That's not random. That's a pattern protecting itself, because growth means stepping into the unknown, and the unknown feels dangerous to your unconscious mind. So it pulls you back to what you already know, even if what you know is frustration, failure, or limitation. This is why people stay stuck for years, not because they lack intelligence, not because they don't want more, but because they're trapped in loops they don't see. They keep trying to change their results without changing the pattern that creates those results. And that's like trying to get a different outcome from the same equation. It doesn't work. And the hardest part is this: these patterns don't feel like patterns. They feel like personality. They feel like this is just who I am. Um, but who you are is not the same as what you've repeated. Your habits are not your identity. Your past is not your future. But if you don't separate yourself from your patterns, you'll keep living inside them. So instead of asking, why does this always happen to me? Try asking, what am I consistently doing that leads me here? Instead of blaming circumstances, start observing repetition. Because repetition is not coincidence, it's information. It's your unconscious showing you something you haven't understood yet. And the moment you see the pattern clearly, not just once, but deeply, you interrupt it. You create a break in the loop. You go from reacting automatically to choosing consciously. And that's the difference between living on autopilot and actually taking control of your life. You keep asking, why does this always happen to me? But you're asking the wrong question. The better question is, what inside me keeps recreating this situation? Because the truth is, the problems in your life are not random. They're patterned. They follow a structure. Different people, different environments, but the emotional outcome feels the same. The stress, the disappointment, the frustration, it keeps returning, not by accident, but by design. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He saw that human beings don't just experience life, they unconsciously organize it. Your mind builds patterns based on past experiences, and then it looks for ways to repeat them. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it wants consistency. It wants what it already understands. And once a pattern is formed, it starts filtering your reality. You don't just see the world as it is, you see it through the lens of what you've lived before. Think about someone who believes deep down that people can't be trusted. They don't walk around saying that out loud. In fact, they might consciously want connection, honesty, closeness. But underneath, there's a quiet expectation. People will disappoint me. So what happens? They become guarded. They hold back. They test others. Sometimes they even push people away before getting too close. And eventually, the relationship breaks. And when it does, they say, "See, I knew it. Veskas. People always let me down." But what they don't see is how their own pattern helped create that outcome. This is how unconscious patterns work. They don't just react to reality, they shape it. They influence how you interpret situations, how you behave, and ultimately what results you get. And because you're inside the pattern, you think the problem is outside of you. Or consider this: someone who constantly procrastinates. They tell themselves they need more motivation, more focus, more discipline. But every time they sit down to do something important, they feel resistance. Not laziness, resistance. They get distracted, they delay, they find something else to do, and later they feel guilty, frustrated, angry at themselves, and the cycle repeats. But what if procrastination isn't the real problem? What if it's a symptom? Maybe underneath that delay is fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being good enough, fear of being judged. So instead of facing that fear directly, the mind avoids the situation altogether. It protects itself by delaying action. And because that fear is unconscious, the person doesn't say, "I'm afraid." They say, "I'm just not productive." But the behavior makes sense when you look deeper. That's the key. Your patterns always make sense once you understand where they come from. But until you understand them, they feel like obstacles, like bad luck, like flaws in your personality. Let me ask you something. Have you noticed how certain situations trigger you more than others? Maybe criticism hits you harder than it should. Maybe rejection feels unbearable. Maybe uncertainty makes you freeze. Those reactions are not about the moment itself. They're about what that moment represents to you internally. The situation is just the trigger. The pattern is already there. And the more you ignore these patterns, the stronger they become. Because every time you repeat them, you reinforce them. You teach your mind, this is how we respond. And over time, it becomes automatic. You don't choose the reaction anymore. It chooses you. This is why people feel stuck, not because they don't know what to do, but because knowing isn't enough. You can understand something logically and still repeat the same behavior emotionally, because patterns live deeper than logic. They live in your unconscious responses. So if you really want to change your life, you have to stop focusing only on outcomes and start examining patterns. Not just what happened, but how it keeps happening. Not just what you did, but why you keep doing it. Because once you see the pattern clearly, it loses some of its power. You begin to catch it in real time. You notice the urge to react the same way, the urge to avoid, the urge to repeat. And in that moment, you have a choice. A small one, maybe, but a real one. And that's where change actually begins. Not when you try harder, not when you force discipline, but when you interrupt the pattern that's been running your life without your permission. There's a part of you that you don't want to see. Not because it isn't there, but because it makes you uncomfortable. The anger you deny, the jealousy you hide, the insecurity you pretend doesn't exist. You push it down, ignore it, cover it with a better image of yourself. You tell yourself, but the truth is, it is you. And the more you reject it, the more control it gains. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not something evil, not something separate from you, but the parts of your personality you've learned to suppress. The traits you were told were unacceptable, the emotions you weren't allowed to express, the sides of you that didn't fit the image you wanted to present. So you buried them. But burying something doesn't make it disappear. It just moves it out of sight. And what's out of sight starts operating in the dark. Let's make this real. Think about someone who always presents themselves as calm, controlled, and rational. They avoid conflict. They pride themselves on being above emotion. But every once in a while, something small happens, and they explode. Not a small reaction, but a disproportionate one. Anger that seems to come out of nowhere, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from everything they've been holding back. The anger they never allowed themselves to feel doesn't vanish. It accumulates. And when it finally surfaces, it's stronger than expected. Or take someone who constantly criticizes others. They judge people for being lazy, weak, or unsuccessful. On the surface, it looks like high standards, but often it's projection, because deep down, they're afraid of those same traits in themselves. Instead of facing that fear, they externalize it. They attack it in others. It's easier to point outward than to look inward. That's how the shadow works. It shows up indirectly, not as something you recognize, but as something you react to. The things that trigger you the most, the people who irritate you the most, the traits you can't stand, often reflect something unresolved within you. And here's the uncomfortable part. You don't just have a good side and a bad side. You have a whole spectrum of traits, both light and dark. But society teaches you to accept only certain parts. Be confident, but not arrogant. Be kind, but not angry. Be strong, but not emotional. So you build an identity around what's acceptable and you reject the rest. But the rejected parts don't disappear. They wait. They wait for moments of stress, pressure, vulnerability, when your control weakens, and then they slip out in your reactions, in your tone, in your decisions. And afterward, you might think, that's not who I am. But it is. It's just the part of you that you haven't integrated yet. Let me ask you something. What traits in other people bother you the most? Is it arrogance, weakness, neediness, dishonesty? Now ask yourself honestly, have you ever shown even a small version of that trait? Maybe not in the same way, maybe not as extreme, but is it completely absent from you? Or is it something you've been trying not to see? Because the shadow doesn't mean you are those traits all the time. It means you have the capacity for them. And when you deny that capacity, you lose control over it. You can't manage what you refuse to acknowledge. This is why people say things like, I don't know what came over me. Something didn't come over you. It came from you, from the part you didn't want to accept. And because you didn't accept it, you couldn't guide it. You couldn't regulate it. You couldn't choose how it showed up. The goal is not to eliminate your shadow. That's impossible. The goal is to recognize it, understand it, and integrate it. To admit, yes, I can be angry. Yes, I can be insecure. Yes, I can be selfish. Not to justify those traits, but to take responsibility for them. Because once you see them clearly, they stop controlling you from the background. And here's the paradox. The more you accept your darker sides, the less power they have over you. Because you're no longer fighting them blindly. You're working with awareness. You're choosing how to express those energies instead of suppressing them until they explode. So instead of asking, how do I get rid of these parts of myself? Ask, what are they trying to show me? Because every shadow carries information about your fears, your wounds, your unmet needs. And if you're willing to face it, not run from it, you don't just become more self-aware, you become more whole. And that's where real strength comes from. Not from pretending to be perfect, but from understanding everything you are and choosing consciously what you become. You keep saying, that's just how things turned out. But what if it didn't just happen to you? What if, step by step, reaction by reaction, you helped create it without even realizing it? Because the hardest truth to accept is this. Most of what you call fate is actually a series of unconscious choices. Not deliberate decisions, not carefully planned moves, but automatic responses you never questioned. Carl Jung warned about this exact illusion. When you don't see the forces driving your behavior, you assume those forces are external. You say life is unfair. You say people are the problem. You say circumstances held you back. And sometimes that's partially true. But it's never the full picture, because between what happens to you and what you become, there's a layer of interpretation, reaction, and decision. And that layer is shaped by your unconscious. Let's slow this down and look at something simple. Imagine someone who gets rejected, maybe in a relationship, maybe in a job opportunity. That moment hurts, naturally. But what happens next is where everything is decided. One path is conscious. They reflect, they learn, they adjust, they move forward. The other path is unconscious. They internalize it as proof of their worthlessness. They withdraw, they avoid future risks, they stop trying, and over time their life starts to shrink. Not because of one rejection, but because of the meaning they attach to it. And here's the key. They didn't consciously choose that meaning. It came from something deeper, maybe old experiences, maybe past failures, maybe beliefs they've carried for years. So when it happens again, they don't say, I'm choosing to give up. They say, This always happens to me. That's the moment where unconscious reaction turns into what they call fate. Or think about anger. Someone disrespects you and you react instantly. You raise your voice, you say something you regret, you damage the relationship. Later you might justify it. They deserved it. Maybe they did. But the real question is, did you choose that reaction or did it happen automatically? Because if it was automatic, then it wasn't a conscious decision. It was a pattern. And patterns repeated over time build outcomes. Outcomes become your life. And your life becomes what you call your destiny. This is why two people can go through similar experiences and end up in completely different places. One uses pain as information, the other uses it as confirmation of their worst beliefs. One reflects, the other reacts. One questions their response, the other defends it. And over time, those small differences create massive gaps in results. Let me ask you something. How many times have you reacted before thinking? How many times have you avoided something because it felt uncomfortable? How many times have you made a decision based on fear, not intention? You didn't sit down and say, I choose fear. You just felt it and followed it. That's how unconscious choice works. It feels like instinct. It feels immediate. It feels justified. But it's still a choice, just not a conscious one. And here's the uncomfortable part. As long as you remain unaware, you'll keep making those choices. You'll keep reacting the same way. You'll keep reinforcing the same outcomes. And then you'll keep calling it fate. Not because you're wrong, but because you're incomplete in your understanding. Because fate is not something that suddenly appears at the end of your life. It's something that's being built every day in the way you respond, in the habits you repeat, in the thoughts you believe without questioning. You don't arrive at a destination randomly. You walk there step by step, even if you don't realize you're walking. So instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Try asking, what am I repeatedly doing that leads me here? Instead of focusing only on the result, look at the process. Look at the small reactions, the automatic decisions, the moments where you didn't pause, didn't question, didn't choose. Because the moment you bring awareness into those moments, something shifts. You create a gap between stimulus and response. And inside that gap is where your real power is. Not in controlling everything around you, but in choosing how you respond to it. And once you start choosing consciously, even in small ways, you stop being dragged by your patterns. You stop repeating blindly. You stop calling everything fate. Because now you're no longer just experiencing your life, you're actively shaping it. You don't need more motivation, you need awareness. Because the truth is, you already know what to do in most situations. You know you should stop procrastinating, stop reacting impulsively, stop repeating the same mistakes. But knowing hasn't changed your behavior. Why? Because the problem isn't information. The problem is that something deeper is still running the show. Carl Jung didn't just point out the existence of the unconscious, he emphasized the necessity of making it conscious. Not in theory, not in abstract ideas, but in your daily life, in real moments, in real reactions. Because awareness is not something you think about once, it's something you practice repeatedly, especially when it's uncomfortable. Let's make this practical. Imagine you're in a situation where you feel triggered. Maybe someone criticizes you. Maybe something doesn't go your way. Normally, your reaction is automatic: defensiveness, frustration, withdrawal. It happens so fast you don't even notice the transition. But this time, you pause, just for a second. You don't suppress the reaction, you observe it. You ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? Not the surface emotion, the deeper one. Is it anger or is it fear? Is it frustration or is it insecurity? That small pause is where awareness begins. Because most people never pause. They jump straight from stimulus to reaction. Something happens, they feel, they act. No gap, no reflection. And that's why the same patterns repeat. But when you insert even a moment of observation, you interrupt the chain. You go from being controlled to being conscious. Let's take another example. You sit down to work on something important, and suddenly you feel the urge to check your phone. It feels harmless. Just a quick distraction, but instead of following it automatically, you stop and ask, why am I avoiding this right now? That question might reveal something deeper. Maybe the task feels overwhelming. Maybe you're afraid of doing it wrong. Maybe you're not as confident as you thought. Now, Instead of blindly escaping, you're seeing the real issue. And once you see it, you can deal with it. This is the difference between reacting and understanding. Reacting keeps you in the loop. Understanding breaks it. But here's where most people struggle, because awareness is uncomfortable. It forces you to see things about yourself that you'd rather ignore: your fears, your insecurities, your patterns. It's much easier to blame circumstances than to examine your own behavior. It's easier to say, I don't have time, than to admit I'm avoiding this because I'm uncertain. But growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens in honesty. So the process is simple, but not easy. You start by observing, not judging, not fixing, just noticing your reactions, your habits, your emotional triggers. Then you question them. Where is this coming from? What does this remind me of? Is this reaction really about this moment? And slowly patterns begin to reveal themselves, not all at once, but piece by piece. And as they reveal themselves, something shifts. You start catching yourself earlier. Instead of realizing after the mistake, you notice during it. Instead of reacting instantly, you hesitate. That hesitation is power, because it gives you a choice. Let me be clear, this doesn't mean you'll suddenly become perfect. You'll still react sometimes. You'll still fall into old patterns. But the difference is, you'll see it. And once you see it, you can't fully go back to being unconscious. Awareness changes the experience, even when the behavior hasn't fully changed yet. And over time, those small moments of awareness add up. A pause here, a question there, a different choice in a familiar situation. That's how patterns break. Not through force, not through pressure, but through consistent observation. So instead of trying to change everything at once, start with one thing, one reaction, one habit, one moment where you usually act automatically, and just watch it. Pay attention to it. Understand it. Because the goal is not to control yourself. It's to understand yourself. And when you truly understand what's driving your behavior, control becomes natural. Not forced, not temporary, but real. And that's how you begin to turn the unconscious into something visible, something you can work with, something that no longer controls you from the background, but becomes part of your awareness. And once that happens, you're no longer just reacting to your life. You're finally participating in it. You've spent years trying to fix your life from the outside, changing routines, setting goals, chasing motivation, yet somehow you keep ending up in the same place. Different year, same patterns, different plans, same outcomes. And at some point, you start to wonder if this is just how things are meant to be. If maybe this is your limit, your fate. But what if nothing is wrong with your potential, and everything comes down to what you haven't been willing to see? Carl Jung made it clear. The greatest force shaping your life is not what happens to you, but what operates within you, unseen, unquestioned, and repeated. And the reason it feels like fate is because it's consistent. It shows up again and again until you finally recognize it. Look back at your life for a moment, not just at the big events, but at the patterns, the way you respond under pressure, the kind of people you let into your life, the habits you fall into when no one is watching. There's a rhythm to it, a structure, something that keeps repeating itself, even when you try to change. And that repetition is not there to trap you. It's there to reveal something to you. Think about someone who always says they want more but never follows through. They start strong, full of intention. But when things get difficult, they stop. They distract themselves. They tell themselves they'll try again later. And later becomes never. From the outside, it looks like a lack of discipline. But if you look deeper, it's often fear. Fear of failure. Fear of not being enough. So they avoid the situation entirely. And every time they avoid it, they reinforce the belief that they can't handle it. Over time, that belief becomes their identity, and that identity becomes their reality. Now imagine the moment they finally see it, not just intellectually, but honestly. They realize, it's not that I can't do this, it's that I've been avoiding the feeling that comes with trying. That realization doesn't magically fix everything, but it changes something fundamental, because now the problem is visible. And what's visible can be challenged. That's the turning point. Not when your life suddenly improves, but when your awareness deepens, when you stop reacting blindly and start observing intentionally, when you stop saying, this is just who I am, and start asking, why am I like this? That question alone can change the direction of your life because it opens the door to understanding instead of repetition. But here's the part most people avoid, because once you see your patterns, you can't unsee them. You can't blame everything on circumstances anymore. You can't pretend you're powerless. Awareness brings responsibility. It asks you to pause before reacting, to question before deciding, to face parts of yourself that are uncomfortable, inconvenient, even painful. And that's where most people stop, not because they can't go further, but because it's easier to stay unconscious than to confront the truth. It's easier to repeat a familiar pain than to step into an unfamiliar growth. So the real question is not whether you understand this. The real question is, what are you going to do with it? Because awareness without action changes nothing. Seeing the pattern is only the first step. The next step is choosing differently, even when it feels unnatural, especially when it feels unnatural, because anything new will feel uncomfortable at first. That discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're breaking out of something old. Start small. The next time you feel triggered, pause. The next time you want to avoid something important, question it. The next time you catch yourself repeating a familiar pattern, interrupt it. Not perfectly, not completely, just enough to create a difference. Because change doesn't happen in one big moment. It happens in small, conscious decisions repeated over time. And slowly, something shifts. You stop being driven by automatic reactions. You stop falling into the same loops. You start seeing options where you used to see only one path. And that's when life begins to feel different. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you feel ready. You don't need certainty to begin. You need honesty. Honesty about what you've been repeating. Honesty about what you've been avoiding. And the willingness to face it, even when it's uncomfortable. Because the moment you choose to see yourself clearly is the moment you stop living unconsciously. And when you stop living unconsciously, you stop calling it fate.